We'll see. So the first question I have for you goes along the lines of, because the thing is, I actually think some questions, like it's true, in a reflections type interview, I actually do sometimes ask questions I know you can't have an answer to, just because sometimes it's necessary to just show that someone went on record and they're sort of telling you, I can't give you an answer, But I generally try to make questions have like some inherent value to them, no matter what you answer. So I notice if anyone ever asks you about the early Immortals League of Legends lineups, where famously, I say famously, some people still forget these details. They were unbelievably dominant in the regular splits, but then had the problems in the playoffs where they got eliminated and usually much earlier than expected, never made the finals. When you look back on these lineups, obviously, it must be disappointing. Yes, you must have expectations they could accomplish more. But now that there's enough time between now and then, do you look back on them? Can you kind of take positives from that? Or do they still seem, in light of the context that, if it was me, I would definitely think, well, if I could have that much success in the regular split, logically, surely we've got to have a chance to win the split or something, surely it should. And especially after the first time, you'd think, right, okay, even if it happens once, next time. How do you look back on those first splits initially?
Yeah, of course, looking back on those splits is a little bit bittersweet for a lot of reasons. But I think probably good to set the record straight about a few things, right? I think nowadays there's a lot of revisionist history around what was going on then. People are saying, well, of course they were going to win every single game. They had Huni and Rainover and Pobelter and Adrian, and they were all so good. Well, at the time that we picked those players up, they weren't necessarily the most highest rated players from the teams that they were coming from. Of course, 2015 Fnatic was an incredibly successful team, but Huni and Rainover overall were seen as kind of the weaker elements of that team compared to Febivin, compared to Reckless. Pobelter had just gotten, I think, in his situation with CLG and Huhi. Wild Turtle certainly hadn't had an amazing time in his last season on TSM. Adrian was seen as like the kind of the dark horse support MVP candidate because he played really well, but he hadn't really made his debut on like a top team yet with top tier teammates across the board. And so I think when we were putting that roster together, what we were doing was making a pretty significant bet that we had a different evaluation of these players and actually they were more valuable than and better players than anyone else was giving them credit for. And I think that bet got proven out, right? I think all those players had incredibly good year in 2016. Of course, results weren't where we wanted them to be. After you have a 17-1 or a 16-2 regular season, you'd like to at least be able to make a final or go to Worlds. But at the same time, it was our first year in competitive League of Legends, right? It was our first year as an esports organization. It was my first year managing a team of any kind. And so I think there's certainly a lot that I learned from that year, even if the results weren't where we wanted them to be. Learned stuff about how to treat players inside and outside of the game, the kind of structure and support staff that a player needs in order to succeed and perform well, the best ways to manage personalities. And certainly all of those are still an ongoing learning process. But that was my first team. It's hard to... you have to credit that team and that year with most of what we became as an esports organization.
So you say there, you gave me the words right out of your own mouth, that you saw more value in these players than other people did. And one of the reasons why, as a new franchise, I use that term obviously in the looser old sense than what we currently use, coming into the NLCS, to even be almost win the league and to perform so well should have been, cause for everyone to celebrate and be like, wow, what a great debut. But actually, I remember in the industry, there was a lot of hard feelings when the initial success was happening in the splits. And there was a fair few people, yes, they didn't tweet it out for obvious reasons, but I'm pretty sure they sort of smirked a little bit when the team lost in the playoffs, because a lot of people at that point in time did say that Immortals was the team that overinflated the salary market and that they spent too much and that they overbid people. I realize Steve Arnett to some degree sort of saved you from that reputation now, but that's what a lot of people in the industry felt like at the time now. And so when you were having the success, some of them did want to be like, well, you can just buy the best players from Fnatic. Is that sort of a kind of a snide attitude? What would you say about that period of time in that context?
I think that's a little ridiculous. I think look, the players we picked up, we weren't going out and buying the top tier free agents at the time, right? It's not like we went to Korea and we went after Faker, or we went after Gorilla, or we went after, at the time, I would guess, like Deft was one of the best free agents from Korea, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly.
Okay.
Like, we didn't go out there and chase the like top free agents on the salary market and pay them like millions of dollars each. In fact, even in that year, we did not have the highest overall salaries in the league, not even close. Nor in the next year, in 2017, did we. So I think, you know, at the time in 2016, I was fairly outspoken about player salaries and what I saw as inefficiencies in the salary market. And so I can certainly understand why people might have felt like I was responsible for part of what happened to the salary market, not just in 2016, not just in 2017, but even happening now in 2018. But I think that's a little reductionist, right? I think the salary market in League of Legends is a completely free market, right? If teams don't want to pay higher salaries, the only thing they need to do is choose not to pay them. Sure. The problem becomes, like, if you don't have a robust system of talent development where you're able to take players that are a little more raw or rough around the edges and develop them into better players, like, that's a really good way to control player salaries, because you get this young player on a relatively low salary contract and you develop him into a better player, and then all of a sudden you have a top tier player for not a lot of money. But no team really had that level of infrastructure, especially in 2015 and 2016 when we entered the league. And so what ended up happening is all these teams, I mean, us included in some ways, right, who were either already in the league and had a kind of competitive pedigree that they needed to uphold, or new teams that were entering the league like us or Energy or Echo Fox, who didn't want to just come in and be mediocre, and definitely didn't want to just come in and get relegated. So we had to come in and kind of try to get the best players that we could in order to succeed in the league. And I also don't want to make it sound like we got our first choice in every single position for the team that we built in 2016. We certainly got very fortunate to like dodge a few bullets and to end up with the players that we did. It wasn't like some sort of massive, analytically backed, perfect scouting method that nobody else had access to. We got lucky in a lot of ways. But I wouldn't have traded anything that we did in 2016 for anything else.
Now, it could well be the case, maybe I'll find out later in this interview, that this is not accurate, but in the early days of coming into League of Legends, it did seem as though actually you did a very good job of ingratiating yourself with the other owners in the LCS, which has proven to be something of a stumbling block, at least politically, for some people who have come into LCS. There's a sentiment that some of the old guard who have had very successful, very well-established teams, if they don't like you, either they can put things out there about you, or maybe, I mean, now technically there is sort of like a group approach with the franchising, but back then in theory there wasn't supposed to be, but there was a feeling that there was, you know, right? So in the early days when you ingratiated yourself in this way, this is one of the areas where I found very interesting, because on the one hand, some of these people are the people who privately or publicly were suggesting what I just said, that perhaps maybe they didn't reference you by name, but, you know, organizations are coming into League of Legends and they're taking all this big investment on, and, you know, people even just question that, is that responsible? I mean, obviously quite rich now when you consider what all those teams themselves have done, but okay, at the time they all believed, you know, they could sort of outcompete the investment teams. So they were talking about teams coming in, taking all this investment, and then the reason why they set that up as a potential ill or evil, or, you know, like risky thing to do, is because then the logic was that's why it would be wrong to overinflate the salary market, you know, because on the most basic level, that always seemed like a weird argument to me, the idea of overinflating the salary market, because it seemed to follow like a very naive idea of economics, which is like, if you bid twice as much for this player, well, it's not like there's only that player in the league, you know. Okay, if you bid twice as much, cool, you can have him if I don't want to pay that much. I mean, I can surely then get the second best player actually for the original amount, you know, unless someone else comes in with a lot of money. Why is the rate going to be high? I mean, I never understood that logic, right? That if, you know, if you've bought a great mid laner, then if I've got Bjergsen, he can go, oh, I want as much as him. And you go, well, we don't have that investment, mate. If we've got the second best amount to offer you, sorry, you're getting a crash course in economics, actually. You pretty much got to accept, haven't you? No one's offering more. So that only works if, like, you know, 2 or 3 people are all bidding higher and higher. Because yes, then you could see how you could get into a bidding war. Do you feel as though some of that era, some of this sentiment, was some of it that you were the new guy? Was any of it sour grapes that other people didn't have investment, and maybe at the time, naively, some of them thought they never would need it, because they had run very successful businesses, they thought they wouldn't ever need to kind of put themselves in this risky position. Do you think there was any of that?
So, I think there are kind of two different parts in what you're asking, and I'll go one by one. So first, I'd say, just talking about the player salary market and inflation of it, investment coming into the space, I think you have to analyze that both at like a micro and a macro level, right? So, of course, on a micro level, like you can't ever force Cloud9 or force Energy to pay 3 times more than they want to pay, right? If they have a budget and they stick to it, and that means that some of the better players go to other teams and they have to content themselves with their 4th choice instead of their 1st choice, then so be it. But I also think that there are fair macro arguments about some of the negative consequences that have happened to esports since the wave of investment has come, right? Like a lot of good things have happened. A lot of things have improved. But I also think, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later on, I also think that there are justifiable concerns about the way that money is being spent and the long-term vision for what a team business model looks like. Speaking more about like relationship with other owners, I mean, look, I came into the league, I was this 20 or 21-year-old kid, depending on whether you're talking about 2015 or 2016, that thought I knew better than everybody else, right? And I was coming in and like getting on my high horse or my soapbox and lecturing people. And so it's unsurprising that in the early days, I rubbed a lot of people the long way. But I think over the years, I've come to understand both how to like conduct myself better and also to have a better appreciation for the perspective of others. And so, happy that at this point in time, my relationships with both my colleagues in Overwatch League and all of the other team owners that work in the space in a significant way, I think our relationship with them is pretty good.
Okay, so you have touched on actually a theme there that I also wanted to ask about, which was like initial perception of you when you came into the league. Because obviously one of the things you did differently to some people, I mean, we've actually seen some big orgs come in and have almost no kind of like front-facing individual. They just come in and they have a team, and then they either ride the success of the team or they just seem content to just do business and let the public think whatever they want. So obviously you were very vocal and made yourself something of a figurehead for Immortals, since you did a lot of media stuff and were engaged with the social media, etc., and took efforts to individually respond to things you thought were important. Now, on a certain level, I think it's hard to criticize any isolated incident of that. It all seemed to have good intentions behind it. But touching on what you said, some people did think, some of this is a bit preachy, isn't it? Like he is sort of telling people whose business he's just come into, you guys are doing it wrong. And, I mean, some people thought the implication was, do it the way I'm doing it. Like I'm doing it the right way, which by the way is understandable. If you're saying that you think there's a correct way, hopefully you would be doing it yourself. But this is part of the sentiment also I think some of the industry people didn't appreciate, which is they felt as though you've come into the space. Yeah, you've done a great job. You've got all this money you can spend, and you can even outbid some of them, as we've just referenced to, and have better players than them. And so you might even have initially more success. But some of them felt as though, okay, there's like a couple of different ways you can succeed in business. Okay, so there's a level of skill required to get someone to give you millions of dollars or to get someone to invest in your idea. Different concepts, by the way, I'll note for people who tend to conflate them. But okay, they're both important skills, right? I might have the best skills in the world at business, but if I can't get the guy to give me the money I need to scale it up to make it a great idea, it'll be a little business, no one will ever hear of it. The problem is people felt as though, what happens after you've got that money? And they felt as though you shouldn't sort of, I won't say brag, but you shouldn't be too set on the idea that you've done it the right way until you've made some money. That was kind of a sentiment that some people had. What would you say to that?
I mean, I think that's a fair sentiment. And certainly if I look back at myself from 3 years ago, I'd say that I probably got a little arrogant, right, about the way that I was coming into the league. And I think a function of that was we were a new team, and I knew that we kind of had to make an impact immediately in order to not just fade away into the background and get overshadowed by a lot of the other old guard teams. It was also partially, a little ego driven. I was this kid who had never really done anything before in a public facing way, and here I was on a pretty big stage, and I wanted to, I clung pretty firmly to my opinions. I was pretty convinced of them. And I think some of them ended up being right and some of them ended up being wrong. But one of the ones that I think ended up being right and that I still feel and believe very deeply and still talk about publicly is the idea that an organization needs to stand for more than its competitive win and loss record. And I think this was a core of why I started an esports organization in the first place. I was a fan of esports. I have told the story a lot, right? But I became a fan of League of Legends during the Season 3 World Championships when Monte Cristo pulled out his Korean hype train gimmick with his train conductor whistle and his ticket puncher, right? Like that sold me on competitive League of Legends, and I started watching esports after that. But as a fan, I never really felt a deep attachment to an organization because there wasn't really anything to get attached to. It felt like every organization was talking about themselves in the same way. And it felt like everyone was just saying, look, we're the best organization. We're going to win. We're going to win all of these championships. Look at all these championships we won. Look at all these good players we had. But when there was player turnover or when those organizations didn't end up winning, because only one organization can win LCS every year, there was nothing else deeper there. So very purposefully, when I started Immortals, I did put myself a little bit front and center, and I made myself a public figure rather than just working behind the scenes, because I was working under an organizational philosophy that there had to be something more to Immortals than just we have good players and we win lots of games and like maybe you like Huni and so you should root for us. There had to be some sort of guiding philosophy or guiding ethical code or guiding unifying vision for all of our fans that gave them something to still be a fan of, even if we weren't winning or even if their favorite player wasn't playing here. And I think, to be honest, 2016 didn't really test that, right? We won so many games that it's hard to tell whether our fans were there because we were winning or whether our fans were there for something bigger. But I think spring of 2017 was a much better test of that. You know, we went from one of the best teams in the league to 7th place and not in playoffs. And I was stunned at the level of fan support that was still there. If you looked at our fan communities, if you looked at, you know, our hardcore fans who were around us during the spring of 2017, even during a really bad spring split, we were still getting a lot of support. We weren't getting the level of hate or negative comments that you can frequently see on other teams' communities. And then when we were able to turn it around for summer of 2017, it just felt all the sweeter because we had experienced the low and then we were at a high. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, and I don't know if I fully answered the question, but
I think you got to it generally.
Okay.
What about this then? So I'm a big believer that whenever you judge, for example, a roster move, a prediction, whatever it might be, it's actually not reasonable to judge it by the result, because that implies that the result tells you what was correct, you know, whereas there's certainly variance, there's different things change over time. You know, sometimes you can make an incorrect decision that something that happens afterwards ends up making it a good decision. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is if people look at the success of the team in the summer, inarguably getting Xmithy was a good move, and that wouldn't in some degrees have been directly possible without having Dardoch as a piece to trade or to sell, whatever the situation was there. It might not have been directly as possible. So someone who wants to say that the summer success was good will say, well, yeah, you needed to have Dardoch in the first place, and then maybe you even needed to, you know, they'd probably spin it like you needed to learn what it is you needed otherwise in a jungler or something, or this core needed. But just looking on the merits of what you knew at the time you signed Dardoch, was it a mistake to sign him? Did you underestimate like what would be required, or did you have some sort of a vision that just didn't come to pass? Could it in fact have just continued if you'd kept him for a year, or it hadn't have been such a short project? What do you think now on that move?
So it's a little hard for me to tell, right? After we traded Dardoch in between spring and summer, I haven't really gotten a behind the scenes picture of what he's like, right? Obviously, he's had competitive success with Echo Fox. I don't know what he's like beyond what I can see on an LCS broadcast. I would say that if I saw the other 4 players on our roster and then I had to pick a jungler to slot into them, I don't think Dardoch would have been the right choice for that roster. But also keep in mind that Dardoch was the second player that we signed, right? We had Pobelter held over from 2016. And Dardoch was the second player, and we had a particular image in our mind of a roster that we were going to construct around those 2 players. And importantly, in my mind, one of the players that was going to be a part of that roster was Huni. of course, what ended up happening is Huni got the offer from SKT. We, even after he had signed a contract with us, we let him go to SKT. And that meant that the roster we were constructing was no longer the same roster. It's hard to debate theoreticals, right? Like, I don't know what would have happened if we ended up with a Huni, Dardoch, Pobelter, Wild Turtle, Ole roster, right? Maybe it would have been amazing. Maybe it would have been even worse and we would have gotten relegated. But I think the intention at the time was to set Dardoch up in a role where he could have input in a team, but he was not kind of de facto the leader within a team. That was something that we had discussed with him a lot before signing him. He really had a desire to be in a team with other people that were strong at decision making and that were able to make calls, and he was able to follow up on those calls. But what ended up happening is in a team with Cody, who was a rookie, and Flame, who had limited English, and Ole, who had some English but limited experience on a bigger stage like an LCS and still limited English. There wasn't really anyone to be that main caller or to make those kind of in-game minute-to-minute decisions aside from Dardoch. And so we ended up not being able to create the structure of the team that we were aiming to create in the first place.
Did Dardoch fit the values of Immortals?
I think
you set me up for that one. I have to ask.
No, it's fair. I mean, look, I think there's a world in which he does. Again, I don't know what kind of person or player he is now that he doesn't play for me, right? But I've seen Dardoch at his best, and when he's at his best, not just at a playing best, but at a personality best, he's incredible. He's a supportive teammate. He makes the right calls. He builds his teammates up. And I've seen Dardoch at not his best, which is, not like that. And I think the Immortals philosophy doesn't require that you come into Immortals a perfectly formed and like all the way matured human being. I think we recognize that everyone has a capacity to change and we want to help them change. I think what ended up happening was because of the, he came in to our team with a particular expectation of what the team and what the structure was going to look like. And that's on me, right? Because I, when pitching him on why he should be a part of Immortals, told him about our plans. And then a lot of those plans didn't come to fruition, and he ended up playing on a very different team than he was expecting to play on. And a different team than we were expecting him to play on. And that meant that it was very difficult for him in spring. So there's no blame being assigned here, right? And I don't think that he's inherently difficult or will always be a bad teammate or anything like that, right? I think looking between spring and summer, there was even a world in which, we evaluated other ways to keep him on and ways to have him continue to be a part of the organization, and just opted instead to go for the Xmithy trade. So I would say that a lot of the things that Dardoch wanted at the time and believed at the time and voiced at the time absolutely fit with the vision of Immortals and the organizational philosophy of Immortals. I think our inability to put the pieces together, it's not just on him, and it's not just on coaching staff, right? It's on the organization itself for not being able to give him and the other players the resources they needed in order to succeed.
When we come to the summer split and Xmithy joins the team, this is another great example of where I feel like a lot of people have been a little bit revisionist in what they thought of that team, because now it's very easy for them to go, well, of course I always thought Xmithy was one of the best junglers in CLG, and then now they know Ole was like an MVP candidate, and obviously even Cody Sun's got on to be a pretty good player. Flame was already good, but had someone who could actually enable him to some degree. And then Pobelter, I've noticed what's good about that is because no one ever really talks trash on Pobelter, it's always very convenient to come back when the teams succeed and be like, yeah, I've always thought Pobelter was good, So collectively, they could find a way to rationalize now that the team was going to be good. But at the time, as I kind of outlined by that context, a lot of things had to happen, even within the 4 players that were already in the team, It's not like they just played identically to spring, you put in Xmithy and then boom, you're in the final, having a chance to win. So what was the summer split like for you? I mean, if in the context of what we've talked about already with having the successes in the previous splits, but then not having the playoff success, it must have been significant, right?
Yeah, I think, well, first I want to note, right, it's hard to talk about summer split and only discuss the Dardoch and Xmithy swap. You also have to talk about Coach Song, who is a very important part of that summer split run. Look, so the reason it's going to be a little difficult for me to answer this question is because personally, after the spring split, I kind of transitioned a little bit in my role. So my role previously was very hands-on with the players, very hands-on inside the team house, very present during scrims. But this was in 2017, a period of time in which Immortals was really growing as an organization, not just in terms of the teams that we fielded, but in terms of the kind of business infrastructure behind what we were doing. And so in that transition from spring to summer was also a transition for me into kind of taking a more organizational and business-facing role rather than being hands-on day-to-day with the competitive staff. So my answers here aren't going to be as informed as stuff previously because I just wasn't there every day. But from my impression, there was a fundamental difference between Immortals 2016 and then Immortals Summer 2017, right? Of course, it looks to the outside world like we added Xmithion's song and everything just clicked and we were suddenly this amazing team. I think more realistically, like Summer Split definitely felt like more of a product of hard work compared to 2016. In 2016, and it's honestly something I've talked to my former players about and my former staff about, nobody can explain it. But in 2016, everyone got there and from day one, it just clicked. Like it was magical in 2016. And I still think to this day, nobody really understands why, even the people that were in that team. But in 2017 in summer, I think it felt a lot more like that was something that was worked for, that was earned, that was hard to achieve. And, I even think that some of the public sentiment around our team in summer 2017 might be inaccurate, right? At first, everyone was saying how bad we would be. That didn't end up being the case. And then I honestly feel like people started overhyping us, right? Like as a team, we still had significant problems even after we had made the finals in summer 2017. And certainly there was no guarantee of us continuing to remain a good team, even if you take that roster forward into 2018. So again, I feel like I'm talking around your question rather than answering it directly, but hopefully that gives some insight.
Right. As an owner or someone at the top of an organization, I will absolutely forgive anyone who thinks that their team is going to win a tournament, especially if they get into a big match, into a final, whatever. I mean, there's been some famous instances, like probably one of my favorites in sports history was in one of the 60s NBA finals where the Lakers famously used to make the finals like every single year, but they lost many, many times to the Boston Celtics. One of these times, the owner was so sure that his team was going to win that he had all these balloons put in the rafters with a net. And then the idea was, as soon as they won, he'd release these balloons. And then, as anyone can tell by the way this story goes, like apparently Fate is a pretty good story writer because a good screenwriter would obviously make it there where you never get to release these balloons. And it actually was a motivating factor to the opponent to win the match. So when you got to this final, again, I've noticed this happens a lot in NALCS. So for some reason, it's like an American sports thing. We don't really do it as much in other places where they'll talk about like the franchise's history. Whereas to me, it's like the players. Like for example, if you make a different New England Patriots team tomorrow, but it doesn't have Tom Brady and Bill Belichick as the coach, I wouldn't really do any logic of like, oh well, they always win the first round matchup by this percent. Like I would say that doesn't really apply, mate. But in this scenario, okay, people will always still use that logic of like, well, in the past it was, of course SK Telecom has to make it to the final because it's SK Telecom or, it's TSM. They always make the final of any LCS. So I'm sure most people using that logic, we're pretty sure TSM would win this final. Did you have any sort of like a special sense? Did you believe Immortals was going to win this final? Did you have any special certainty?
I think we were all realistic about it, right? We knew as soon as we had qualified for the final that we had already made Worlds. And so at some point we were kind of just playing for pride. Of course, everyone still wanted to win, but I think we were all pretty realistic that we weren't necessarily favored against TSM. And we ended up playing what was, I think, a pretty close series, right? We lost, 3-1, and yes. the deciding game was a pretty significant comeback from them after we threw away a very significant gold lead. So there's a world in which, that series goes to a game 5 and the whole narrative around that series is very different. But I also think, from being there in Boston after the loss, like, of course, people were disappointed that we lost, but it wasn't like we lost, now we're not going to Worlds, right? It was whether we win or lose that series, we're still flying out to get ready for Worlds. So, the results are kind of the same, even if we're going to take a day or two to be sad and mope.
Sure. So even though, according to the chronological timeline, I should ask you here about the CSGO team, because obviously the CSGO team quite simultaneously had its own success and its own turnaround, I think. But I'll do that separately because I realise there's not as much overlap necessarily between League of Legends fans and CSGO fans.
Sure.
So let's do that a little bit later and stick with the League of Legends stuff. So right, we'll skip over the world stuff because obviously it didn't go well, and it's not outrageous that it didn't go as well. You know, there was some good teams in this group. But what I want to ask about, unsurprisingly, is what happens after this. Because I know myself, I was thinking, right, well, now they've made the finals with Immortals. Obviously, I've always been a great admirer of Flame, right? Let's see what happens with this team next split, or let's see what they can do in the off-season if they're going to decide to go after a free agent or something. You know, there's so many different possibilities here. They're all so exciting. It obviously changes the whole narrative of the franchise itself after the failures the year before. So how do we get from this point, making the final, going to Worlds, to this sudden point in the off-season where people hear there isn't going to be an Immortals in the franchising? I mean, first of all, initially, franchising is something you are one of the people who heavily pushed for, right? People famously, at the time, linked back to that interview, which now is somewhat infamous, where you were there with Travis and the Riot people, and you're talking about the concept of doing franchising. And part of the reason why people thought that was funny, in a kind of dark humor sense, is because they assumed you would be one of the main people pushing for this, and that the fact that you're in this interview even is because we all thought you would be one of the first people who would be accepted.
Let's rein that one in a little bit, right? I think the narrative around that particular interview is, oh, Riot picked Reggie and Noah to be in this interview. Like, no, that was a Yahoo Esports pick. Okay. That was a Travis pick. That wasn't like... I appreciate that, and I think it was a good interview. I enjoy watching that interview. Andy and I got some good ones in at each other. But... that certainly was not like a Riot endorsed, this is our favorite two owners, right? So okay. I don't want that to be perceived that way. I mean, to answer, or rather not answer your broader question, like, of course, there's not a lot I can talk about around the franchising process, or, you know, permanent partnership process, or whatever you want to call it. Of course, very disappointed we were not included in that. I've said that publicly before. Again, kind of struggling to figure out what I can actually say around this. I'd say, you know, separate from the actual permanent partnership process, I think you and I were both excited, as well as I'm sure many other people in the community were, to kind of see where things took that team and our organization the next year in LCS. I think we had some interesting plans that, you know, hard to tell whether they would have worked out or not, but at least from a theoretical perspective, we felt pretty good about the direction for our roster and our organization in League of Legends in 2018 had we been selected. Again, like if you want to ask more specific questions, I'll be able to more specifically. Yeah.
How about this? Because the good thing about this question is it doesn't necessarily have to be literal specifics that maybe are tied up in an NDA. It can be speculation on a more abstract topic. So one of the problems with this news coming out is, as much as there were some people who were very sympathetic on the grounds of the players, for example, like, well, they've just had a team in the finals, you know, this is going to be so horrible to those guys that they're not going to be maybe in the league anymore, or they'll have to play for other teams. Okay, that shouldn't really obviously have anything to do with this particular topic, but I can understand why that would generate sympathy. Fans obviously like people on the basis of personality. They don't always know the ins and outs of business. But another reason why people were sympathetic was the logic of, like, oh, well, they thought, right, Noah seems like one of the best owners as well, based on all the interviews that he's done, and he sounds like he knows what he's doing in business. But actually, this is where I noticed there was like in public, maybe only a very minor backlash. But again, I noticed not that many of the owners really came out and were like, hey, what the hell's this? Like, this is bullshit or anything. You know, they were somewhat conspicuous in their silence on this topic, as in the current owners and the ones who themselves were going to be in. Because here's the thing, yes, there's no straw man. They don't have to come out and say, fuck Riot. Like, people have before been very clear when they didn't appreciate something Riot did, and sort of done a sort of nudge in how they've said it publicly, and the implication being, you know, I don't really approve of this, or I hope this doesn't happen again, you know, that sort of a thing. There wasn't much of that, I noticed, and part of the reason why is, again, this shows the power of narratives. Some of the things I asked you earlier in the interview, some people, when they heard this story, which was reported at least, that it's because maybe either Riot or some of the other permanent partners didn't appreciate the business model or the particular plan that the Immortals had for their organization, and how somehow this would affect them if everyone was in one group, you know, that was all supposed to be working together for the sake of the league, not just competing against each other. People did kind of tie that to the narrative of, oh, well, maybe these guys were just really good at getting a lot of money, but they don't have a proper plan, or they haven't shown yet that they have a business that's going to make all the money, which obviously is what a lot of these guys hung their hat on. What would you say to that as a more abstract topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that I certainly didn't have any expectations that other owners would speak up about being disappointed that we weren't included. I mean, that's a really poor way to, really good way to get off on the wrong foot with the publisher that you just entered into a permanent partnership with. I think it would be an unreasonable expectation to ask people to like speak up about what happened with us, whether or not they actually disagreed with it. If I was included and someone else wasn't included, I can't imagine that I would have gone out of my way to damage a relationship with a permanent partner over something like that, especially without knowing the details, right? As much as people might have liked my interviews and as much as I might have been friendly with other team owners, the process was relatively opaque for everybody, right? Like, I have no idea why Cloud9 got in and we didn't get in, nor should I, right? Like, that's not really my business. And so it's a little weird to like ask Jack, hey, can you go out on a limb for me when you have no inside information into how this process went down? So that is like not actually something that I'm upset about or anything. In terms of your question around like business model and finances, like, honestly, we still don't know where that story came from. Like, that, again, like I'm limited in how much I can talk about. Do you think it's implausible
that this was a factor?
To the best of my knowledge, it was not a major factor. But again, like, I'm limited in what I can talk about, and I'm limited in how much I know. I would say that just from my knowledge of my company's finances relative to the finances of, or at least what I know about them from other teams, our finances are not meaningfully different compared to a lot of the other teams in the space, right? I don't want to talk about just the permanent partnership process in LCS because, again, it's a little opaque. I don't know all the details, and I don't want to make assumptions or assertions based on limited factual basis, right? But from what I know, which is a decent amount, I would hope, our company's finances are not dramatically different from those of other teams in the space.
So, okay, this is something I want to ask about then, which is not about your team, but about the general space in that sense. Because if people want to tie it to that, part of the reason why that's something of a strange reason as to why this would be like the decisive factor is every single team pretty much who's in that permanent partnership program put themselves in a position like Immortals was, with big investments or partnerships with massive sports teams, etc. And so no matter whether or not, like, let's say somehow, I don't know how this would be different in any way, but let's imagine what someone naively might think, that maybe having a huge sports team means you at least can ensure the investment for longer or something. That's about the only way I can see that it would be different, because the logic on the other end that, it's not a sound business model because, it's like a lot of investment, but how are you going to make the money? Isn't everyone pretty much in that position now? I mean, everyone's taken on a lot of investment. They've had to pay this big buy-in. And at least for a few years, it's not really going to be something where anyone could promise me, oh, don't worry, Thorin, I'm going to make 300% what the investment, no one could really give me that number. Everyone, to some degree, there's a level of risk involved, right?
Yeah, and look, this is opening a pretty broad topic that I'll do my best to address. But then, if you have pointed follow-ups, feel free. But this kind of dives into a topic that I've been pretty passionate in thinking about over the last few months, which is really like understanding the economics and the business models in the space, right? So for people to understand why most teams lose money in the space now when they didn't really 3 years ago, right? Well, maybe more, like 4 or 5 years ago, right? Like 4 or 5 years ago, there was very little outside investment. So if you were losing money as a team, you would eventually go bankrupt, right? So teams like Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, which was Curse for a lot of that time, like these were businesses with solid fundamentals, right? They were making good revenue relative to their costs. They were sustaining themselves. And then this new wave of investment came along, right? The Us, Energy, Echo Fox, and then many more afterwards. I think what people don't understand is they don't understand once that investment comes in, why do teams stop being profitable? And the answer is, A, when those investments come in, a lot of the variable costs of teams, i.e. player salaries, go up pretty significantly. B, there's a lot more competition in the revenue market, right? For a long time in North America, like really only e.g. Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, those are really the only big teams you could sponsor if you were a sponsor looking to get involved in esports. Suddenly that was no longer the case. And second or third, even those legacy teams, once they started taking on investment, and for us, when we joined, these outside investors aren't looking at the space in order to build this like small but profitable business, right? Like if you're an esports team and you're making a profit of $500,000 a year, like that's great, right? It's a nice little business. And if you're there working for yourself and you're the only owner of your company, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you're trying to raise a lot of money at a higher valuation and you're trying to build a really large and successful and scalable business, like it's not good to be a profitable business that profits $500,000 a year. That's not a win, right? Like you need to find a path to be bigger than that. And in order to be bigger than that, you need to be able to spend money to grow and to build up your revenue generating infrastructure. And I'm going to get a little like technical or geeky here about it, but like one of my, I wouldn't say concerns, but one of the things that I've been very cognizant of during my time in the space is really focusing on how when we are bringing in investment dollars into our company, we're not just using those investment dollars to kind of fund variable costs like player salaries, right? Because if I'm paying Huni $1 million or $500,000 or $250,000, it's still Huni. And I'm still going to be able to make the same amount of money or branding or content around him, no matter how much I happen to be paying him in salary. So one of the things that we're very focused on here is what are the ways that we can deploy capital and deploy investment money in a way that really builds our infrastructure and allows us to scale as a business from a revenue perspective. So if we're going to raise $1 million, how do we deploy that $1 million so that 3 years from now, we're able to make more money in revenue and more money in profit than we are today? And I don't necessarily believe that funneling all of that into player salaries is the way that you're going to make more revenue in 3 years from now. I think there are other infrastructural plays that you'll have to make. I'm not going to talk about any of the ones that we're making quite yet, but I'm sure you'll see them at some point. So that's kind of one just general idea that I'll package on the side. The other general idea that I'll package is just it's really important to me that people understand the differences in investors in the space. I think it's a little bit lazy, but also I understand why it happens. But I think a lot of fans, say, oh, these guys raised $3 million and these other guys raised $3 million. Their investors must be largely the same. And they're not at all, right? Like investors in the space are very different in terms of what they're looking to get out of their involvement, whether they're a VC fund or a corporation or a wealthy individual, like how much they actually know about the space, right? Investors are so varied across esports, and there are some really good ones and there are some that are not so good. And I'm really happy to say that the investors that make up the majority of the funding and majority of the ownership of Immortals are educated and sophisticated about the space. They're passionate about the space, and they're not just involved because they think, oh, 3 years from now I can sell Immortals for more money than I bought it for. They're involved because they have core businesses and core strategic value from continuing to be involved in esports, which is why they invested in Immortals in the first place.
Right, I want to just check something. So I have my timeline right. When that famous thing happened where Reginald and some of the others came out, it was spurred by that infamous line by Tryndamere about like love me some Reggie and all that. That was 2016, was it?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think it was 2016. I think it was 2017.
I'll see if I can double check that.
I'm trying to remember where it was relative to the PEA thing, and I think it was after the PEA thing.
No, apparently it was 2016. Okay,
fair enough.
At least as far as I can tell.
It all blends together.
So the reason I asked this question is because that already is a moment where it's at least strongly implied that the other owners wanted something along the lines of the permanent partnership model, a franchise system, and they're already making it clear. In fact, it's one of the first times that they'd said something publicly that, they run some of these businesses at a loss, at least in terms of the League of Legends division, as I noticed the way a lot of them phrased it. Because obviously the context of this topic was someone perhaps naively suggesting that, League of Legends was the big money maker and that they were actually taking all these crazy profits and putting them in CSGO or whatever, which, it's easy to laugh at now. Yeah. And obviously, listen, I wouldn't expect someone who's working at the top of Riot to necessarily know what's going on in these areas of other orgs. It's understandable he's overstepping his...
Well, I don't know. I think Mark
bit.
did make a fair point in that, right? Like, I don't want to write it off completely, even though, League of Legends is not a massive or at least, when I was involved. I don't know what it looks like nowadays,
Okay.
but when I was involved, it wasn't a massive profit driver. I think Mark actually made a good point, which connects to what I mentioned earlier, right? Because there was a long time where Cloud9 was just a League of Legends organization, and TSM was just a League of Legends organization, and Immortals was just a League of Legends organization. And we were sustainable, right? Like, we were a sustainable organization when we were just League of Legends. We didn't need to raise additional capital in order to stay alive. But in order to hit a scalable point where we weren't just a small business run by a passionate business owner who did this because they loved it, but to create a real commercial venture around this, we had to scale outside of League of Legends. And that's kind of the point at which you have to run at a loss in order to grow. And so even though I think Mark's point was a little bit off, I think the sentiment behind it makes sense, right? Like, I think he was looking at it and thinking, well, if these guys had just stuck around in League of Legends, they'd be doing fine. If they didn't have a Counter-Strike division, or they didn't have a whatever other division, Dota division, then they would be doing fine. And I can understand that sentiment, but I think from our side, we felt the pressure to expand beyond just League of Legends, because as much as League of Legends might have been sustainable by itself, League of Legends was not necessarily scalable by itself.
Because in this context, okay, it's certainly the case that nearly all these teams I'm talking about, the mainstays of LCS, nearly all of them to some degree flirted with the idea of getting involved in the Overwatch League, or had discussions, or even some of them, I can tell you actually, some of them even told some of their players that they were going to have an Overwatch League spot, even though indeed some of them never made their way into the Overwatch League. So some of them were more on course than they thought they were, and it seems like it was genuine to some degree. So in a world in which they either might have been in the Overwatch League, or there might have one day been franchising or something, wouldn't they, no matter what, have had to eventually take on this investment? Like, I know some of them held out till the end and did it when they basically had to, when they wanted to come into an LCS franchising or come into Overwatch League at that point, just have the money to pay the buy-in. Some of them needed to get the investment. Were some of them naive in thinking up to as late as 2017 that we can just keep running a business and not have investment?
I mean, I don't think any of them were thinking about it that way, at least from what I know behind the scenes, right? I think everyone understood essentially a version of what I'm saying, right? They understood that they were more than able to continue to run their businesses as they existed today without needing to bring on outside capital, unless, of course, they wanted to spend a bunch of money on an Overwatch League slot or a bunch of money on a permanent partner slot in LCS. But I also think that, they're good businessmen, right? Like, again, I think we're using Steve and Andy and Jack as the kind of proxies for endemic esports organizations. And as much as they all might be really passionate about esports, I think all of them also have the necessary ambition to want to grow bigger. And I think they recognize that in order to grow bigger, accessing not just outside capital, but outside expertise, right? Outside operational knowledge, outside relationships, all of that was really going to help them scale the same way it's helped an organization like us scale. Sorry, I feel like there was a piece of your question that I missed.
The idea was back. Would they have needed the investment regardless? Like, for example, if they didn't end up being an LCS and they went to Overwatch League, would they have had to take this investment anyway? In fact, would they have needed it regardless of if these leagues had come alive? Would just have stayed with the old LCS model? Should they have taken it on at some point anyhow?
I mean, again, like it's not really a question for me to answer. It's a question for them to answer, because
just speculation on your part, mate.
Sure. I mean, look, need in order to survive? Probably not, right? Need in order to grow? Need in order to scale? Yeah, right? I don't think like Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, these are great brands, right? Like, they could certainly survive just fine by themselves, right? I mean, like, EG without as much outside investment has survived. But there's a big difference between surviving and growing, or surviving and scaling, or surviving and maintaining a position of power and dominance within the scene. And like Jack and Andy and Steve didn't get to where they were because they were just like happy-go-lucky guys that were passionate about esports, right? Like, these are businessmen. They're smart. They're cunning. They know what it takes to grow their businesses, and they did it for a long time in a bootstrapped way without accessing outside resources. And now they have access to outside resources. They have access to investment the same way other organizations do, and that's provided them tools that they need to grow their business. The piece I think I forgot to answer earlier was just like, I think an implication around me being one of the teams that pushed for permanent partnerships and then didn't get admitted, which, of course stings a little bit, but, it doesn't change what I think about the necessity of stable, permanent partnered or stable franchised leagues in order to grow real infrastructure and in order to provide stability to players and organizations, right? Like, I'm sure we're going to talk about Overwatch League, but I'm a huge fan of Overwatch League. If we were independent of being involved in League of Legends, I think moving towards a permanent partnership model in North American LCS is still the right move.
So when, obviously, the Overwatch League is the one that publicly was known first that this is going to happen and it's going to have these big buy-ins, it's going to be a franchise system, and this is before the whole permanent partnership thing happened. I mean, it was basically the same year, sort of, that a lot of this stuff was out there, and then as we came through that year, we found out that we'd have this permanent partnership approach. Right, in this situation, since, as I said, a lot of these teams, which now, obviously, we just think of as LCS teams because they didn't go into the Overwatch League. They all were flirting with it. They all had, most of them had teams in Overwatch. In fact, teams that they looked to have put money in terms of infrastructure, and like they were building to potentially take some of these squads into the Overwatch League if they could. I talked to some of these owners, and I actually said to some of them, because as I said, some of them hadn't yet taken on any investment. I said, okay, well, if it's true, the kind of numbers we're hearing about the buy-ins for both leagues, would you have to choose? Like, would you decide, right, I'll either be in the LCS or I'll be in Overwatch again? And most of them laughed that off and told me, no. Like, I could always have taken on investment anytime I wanted. And, if I can take on 10 million for this league, as long as I can convince the investors, I can definitely get someone to give me 20 million for the other league, as long as the business plan makes sense. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I can do both. But it's certainly convenient that when the Overwatch League and the permanent partnership process were announced in terms of the teams, you only had one team that had a track record in the LCS in Overwatch League, which was actually Team Envious, which obviously became Dallas. Oh, no, wait, it wasn't Envious. Who am I thinking of?
You're thinking of Cloud9.
Cloud9, that's it. Yes, I got it wrong. It's Cloud9. The other team obviously ended up being Optic, but at the time they weren't in the LCS, so I feel like that's like an unfair comparison. So
and really the other way with Envy that was in the LCS and then was also not.
Yes, I got it wrong on that one. Sure. Yes, that's correct. Okay, so it was only Cloud9 who ended up doing both. Now, the implication there is that some of these teams actually chose that they didn't want to be in the Overwatch League. So, as someone with no inside information, my speculation there would be that, okay, perhaps at different points in times, they were totally genuine about their interest in both. But with the timing, that from the public-facing aspect, it looks from the outside as though Overwatch League, to some degree, either forced Riot's hand or maybe sped up the process of us getting to a franchising model, just over a year from when people are complaining that they want this approach. Do you think any of these teams sort of used the threat of like, well, maybe we'll just be an Overwatch League team as leverage to get themselves the franchising model quicker or to get into it? What do you think? I mean, as much as anyone will say this is business and stuff, if you do an NALCS and it doesn't have Cloud9, TSM, Team Liquid, if it doesn't have any of these orgs, that is a big deal, at least for fans, right?
Yeah, I mean, I again, like, I don't have a ton of inside information on this. I would highly doubt that, like, Cloud9 and TSM threatened to drop out of League of Legends. I think
but the threat's implicit in the potential, right? You don't have to literally say it.
I mean, I don't know.
The message is sent the same way either way.
Riot seemed to be very comfortable with us being only an Overwatch League team and not an LCS team. So
you aren't Team Liquid or TSM, mate.
That's true. We're not. Look, I think from my perspective, look, it's not the question that you said out loud, but I think it's the question that you're implying. You can correct me if I'm wrong, right? Which is why, when so many of these LCS teams said that they had the ability to raise extra capital for Overwatch League.
Yeah, why aren't they in Overwatch League?
Why aren't they in Overwatch?
One or the other seems to be implied, right? That either they were using it as a bargaining chip, and listen, they might have done it in a smart way, like, hey, if it doesn't work out, maybe we take the bargaining chip, we go that way as well. But it's certainly, if I wanted to ensure all the LCS stuff, that would be a cool way to do it, and also have another option if I preferred that one at the end as well.
Yeah, I just don't, from what my knowledge is of timelines, I don't think that that's the case. I mean, maybe Riot felt pressured, and so that's why they did it, but not from my perspective, right? Riot has never really historically been a company that is willing to radically shift their direction in a reactive way. So I don't think that's why that happened, and I certainly don't think it was used as an explicit bargaining chip. I also don't think that the reason they're not...
As a follow-on then,
sure.
isn't it strange? Put it this way, as an outsider, it looks strange that all these teams had the option and they didn't exercise.
I don't think it's strange at all. I don't think it's strange at all. Right. I think certainly, if you had the opportunity to be in both, there were a lot of investors that were willing to give you the capital in order to do that. So it's not an ability issue. But I do think at the time that Overwatch League was starting up, it was proposing a radically different model than had ever been seen in esports. Not just the permanent partnership or franchise or permanent slot model, right? Like the core of how the business was going to work was radically different than anything that has been seen in esports, like maybe since CGS, in that it had a localized model. A lot of the as a team, a lot of my future business potential is not just dependent on how many sponsors the league sells or how many sponsors I sell. Is dependent on how many tickets can I sell when it's time for me to go to a home stadium. Like that is such a fundamentally different business model. It is not at all surprising to me that at the time, teams that had never worked under that type of business model and had no idea whether the game could even support a league like that, it's not surprising to me that they might have opted not to be a part of it. Again, like I'm not involved in any of those conversations. I don't know the details behind it. But look, even for us, when we were choosing proactively to be a part of Overwatch League, we recognized that it was not a sure thing, right? Like there needed to be some proof in the pudding to be able to turn that into a real league. And look, credit to them, Activision Blizzard has not just delivered, but over-delivered massively on everyone's expectations. Over-delivered on viewership, over-delivered on the commercialization and the level of sponsors that they've gotten into the league, over-delivered on the local fan engagement element, which is so much stronger than I thought it would be in the first year. And so it's not surprising to me that teams that had stable businesses elsewhere might have looked at Overwatch League and been like, well, this seems risky. This is different than something we're used to. The LCS model is closer to what we're used to. So even if we might have the opportunity to do both, maybe we don't want to do both. That's really not for me to say, but there is a reason that Overwatch League, I think, got a lot of the public criticism that it did because it was doing things in a fundamentally different way. And there's also a reason I think that Overwatch League is going to be massively more successful than many of the esports leagues that preceded it because it is doing things in a different way.
Okay. What about this then? Is just a quick follow-up to close that part of the topic up. Do you think the fact that part of being an Overwatch League was you had to start a separate brand that was exclusive to the Overwatch League, was that in any way a factor, do you think, for any big teams and their decisions? Like, is that actually a separate challenge? If you have to raise the money and you have to get 20 million, whatever, is that irrelevant and you can just start a new business? It would be the same, basically, operations aspects. What do you think on that?
Well, look, from our side, it's been pretty easy to do. I think from Cloud9's side, it hasn't been super difficult to do. And again, I think this kind of ties into the other piece, right? In a world in which, as a team, you survive as a business by selling sponsorships across all of your divisions, it's ludicrous to think that you'd split out one team into a separate brand, right? Like, why would you ever do that? That just makes it harder to sell sponsorships. But from my perspective, if your business model is not going to be, how do I just sell the most sponsorships across all of these digital assets? And it's instead more, how do I build a local fan base and drive local ticketing to a stadium and do merchandising and all this stuff? Then I think it makes a lot more sense to create a kind of separated and specific brand for that game, for Overwatch. So I think it's kind of tied in, right? Like, I think the way you feel about creating a separate brand has a lot of correlation with how you feel about the differentiated business model. Okay.
Right. Obviously, as you actually alluded to earlier, Cloud9 is the team that is not only mainstay LCS team, but has the London Spitfire and the Overwatch League. They're in both, whereas the Optic one's a bit different because they were accepted sort of simultaneously to both. Right, they didn't really have establishment in either for obvious reasons because there wasn't an Overwatch League. Right. In that setting, that also actually offset a lot of conspiracy theories, which was otherwise would have been, well, the reason why Immortals wasn't picked is because they're in the Overwatch League, because that actually there was a hard split other than Cloud9, basically. People were in one or the other.
Sure.
Just on a purely your personal feelings, does the fact that they are in both, do you have any sort of, is that annoying? Is it a bit, do you have any resentment towards the fact that you can't be in both?
I mean, no, for a lot of reasons, right? Like, no, number one, because I like Jack and think he's good at what he does, and I'd
People
rather...
can like their friends and still feel like,
let me finish.
They're a bit successful.
It's not like I like my friends and I'm like, bloody hell, he's a bit successful. A, because I don't say bloody hell because I'm not from the UK. But more so, right? Like, I'm happy that Jack is in both because I'd rather be working with him in Overwatch League than working with a different random person in Overwatch League, right? It's not just he's my friend and I like him. It's I think Cloud9 is a good business, and Jack and the other people that work with him are good business people. And I would rather be partnered with good business people than be partnered with people I don't know. So I am happy that he is in Overwatch League because that means we get to work together on stuff. As far as it applies for me, like, I, of course, am not going to talk about specific reasons why we are not involved in the LCS permanent partnership process. So, like, there's nothing to really answer there, right? I'm not going to talk about to what extent Overwatch League was a factor in the decision-making process around LCS.
Sure. So, if what you say is accurate, that the Overwatch League has over-delivered on all these aspects, including things like financial components, it's not just fan engagement and viewers and these sorts of, and just basic running of the operations of the league, which people didn't know how that would all roll out. If this is the case, does it make it so that it's not a big deal to not be in the LCS? You can just look past that as like that was a separate chapter. Okay, that was a different Immortals chapter, and it's not a big deal anymore. Are you over it completely? Is Overwatch League sort of like essentially is the positive of that able to draw away any sort of looking back at the negative of what could have been?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just the kind of person that, like, I don't hold on to that kind of resentment, right? Like, I'm of course not over it, nor will I ever be over it. Like, it will always hurt. But at the same time, like, that, in some ways, like, that crisis might be a little bit of a dramatic statement, right? But, like, certainly at the time, it was not super fun to be in my position. But that whole segment of the company's history, I think, taught me a lot and forced me to innovate, right? Like, what's the phrase? Like, necessity is the mother of invention. So, like, we were in a tough spot as an organization, right? We were one of the top LCS teams. Everyone thought we were going to be involved in LCS going forward, including us. And then we weren't. And that really required us to take a solid look at our model and how we were thinking about growing the organization and how we were thinking about operations. And that led, I think, to a lot of really good things for the organization. Some of which you'll see in the near future, some of which you will see in the more medium to long-term future. But things that I probably would not have chosen to pursue or that I would not have chosen to do if we were involved in LCS. Because, that would have not really spurred me to take that long, hard look at the way that an esports team works. So in many ways, like, even though, of course, if I could go back in time and pick being in LCS or not being in LCS, I might pick being in LCS. I'm also thankful that period of time gave me the opportunity to really explore what I wanted to do with the Immortals organization and kind of come to the conclusion that there was more that we could be doing beyond what we were working on previously.
Even if you say, though, that it sounds a bit dramatic to say crisis, if people think of it from this perspective, I know especially people who are taking on investment in something like LCS, they are thinking years down the line. They're not thinking, oh, what I'm going to do this split. Sure. And definitely, practically no team in the league is thinking, oh, cool, we've got these players that we're paying a salary for all this now. Well, this is just like work for hire, and you're just going to work for this period of time. No, it's all building into something and a bigger vision. And perhaps sometimes when you're selling the investors on it, it's the idea of we're going to be in this league for many years. And we're going to
you have to.
Yes, obviously. So what I wanted to ask was, because I haven't really heard anyone address this. What is kind of what happens to a big org who's invested a lot, created infrastructure, taken on more investment, is ready, basically has everything planned? Because, you're hoping for the best. You're hoping that all the proposal gets accepted and that you're part of this league that, as I said, you're someone who certainly was in line with this vision. You wanted this to happen. How can you just overnight have to shut it all down? I mean, I know people are going to say, oh, I'm sure he got paid for the slot and all that stuff. Yeah, but even so, that's different from what we're talking about here. So what happens when you have to just up and leave town, basically, sort of?
Well, I think we were fortunate that a lot of our investment was transferable, right? Like, a lot of our investment dollars and time went into building a really state-of-the-art campus for our players to practice from and train at, and for all of our business staff to work at. And at a certain level, like, it doesn't really matter whether a room is being used for a League of Legends team or, say, a Counter-Strike team. I think some investment was less transferable, right? You obviously can't take a League of Legends coach and turn them into an Overwatch coach. And so, saying goodbye to all the staff and all the players who were part of our organization was not easy. But at the same time, I think we had very quickly after LCS, we found a different direction to go in that was still a good use of our financial resources. It was a good use of our time and our operational resources, and that we think will produce something pretty big and pretty special. Hard to say whether it's more bigger and more special than remaining in LCS could have been, but that's not really for me to say anyway.
Sure. That was part one of my interview with Noah. We got pretty in depth, and so as a result, I decided, since we talked about 3 different games, League of Legends, Overwatch League, so Overwatch, and CSGO, I would divide them up according to games. So in part 2, he discusses the Overwatch League, and that part should be out soon. And then the third part will be about the ill-fated CSGO team of Immortals. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset, and now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.